The skies over Babylon were heavy with clouds, pregnant with the threat of an impending storm. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the very heavens were holding their breath in anticipation of the bloodshed to come. In the distance, the ground trembled under the weight of an approaching force, a force so vast and terrible that it seemed as though the earth itself was straining to contain it. Cyrus the Great had returned. On the horizon, like the crest of a dark wave ready to break, the Persian army advanced. It was a sight to inspire dread, a relentless tide of men and beasts, their banners fluttering in the wind like the wings of carrion birds. The first layer of the attack force, the infantry, archers, and chariots, stretched out as far as the eye could see, a living machine of war, all iron and fire, eager to swallow the city whole. Behind them, waiting like a coiled serpent, was the second layer, the cavalry. Mounted on powerful steeds, the Persian horsemen were the swift harbingers of death, their armor glinting ominously in the half-light of the overcast sky. These warriors were the vanguard of Cyrus's power, the steel tip of the spear aimed directly at Babylon's heart. And then, in the rear, moving slowly but inexorably forward, was the final layer, the giants. 10 of them, born of the earth, forged in the fires of chaos, their massive forms towering over even the tallest of men. They were the stuff of nightmares, creatures from an age long forgotten, their bodies hewn from stone and clay, their eyes glowing with an inner fire that spoke of ancient hatreds and unquenchable rage. Leading them was Gruggith, the Stonebreaker, his form wreathed in the dark aura of his anger and anticipation. Within the walls of Babylon, the defenders stood ready, their hearts hardened by the knowledge that this day would determine their fate. Ira, the man of cold fire, the savior of the city, stood atop the highest wall, his gaze fixed on the approaching army. The Blazefrost celestial sword hung at his side, its cold presence a comfort in the face of the storm that was about to descend upon them. The city had faced many threats before, but none like this. None so vast, none so relentless, none so imbued with the fury of a man who had been once denied. Cyrus the Great had returned to finish what he had begun, and he had brought with him an army that seemed to stretch to the very edges of the world. As the first ranks of the Persian infantry neared the walls, the silence that had gripped the city was shattered by the blare of war horns, the cry of 1,000 voices raised in a single, terrible roar. The battle had begun. The onslaught begins. The infantry surged forward, their ranks bristling with spears and shields, their faces set in grim determination. Behind them, the archers let loose a hail of arrows that darkened the sky, each one tipped with iron and aimed at the defenders on the walls. The chariots followed, their wheels spinning wildly as they hurtled toward the city gates, their drivers urging the horses onward with cruel whips. Ira watched the assault unfold, his mind cold and clear, his heart steady. He had prepared for this moment, trained his men to withstand the initial shock of the Persian advance. The walls of Babylon had been rebuilt, reinforced with layers of stone and iron, and the soldiers under his command were as ready as they could be. "Hold the line!" Ira shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Do not let them breach the walls. This is our city, and we will not let it fall." The Babylonians responded with a fierce cry of their own, a sound that reverberated through the stone and steel of the city's defenses. They met the Persian onslaught with a barrage of arrows and stones, their hands steady, their aim true. The air was filled with the sounds of clashing metal, the shouts of men, and the groans of the dying. For a time, it seemed as though Babylon might hold. The infantry pressed forward, but the walls held firm, and the defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The archers on the walls picked off the Persian soldiers with deadly precision, and the boiling oil poured from the battlements scalded those who dared to come too close. The chariots, though swift and deadly, found themselves slowed by the debris and the uneven ground outside the gates, their drivers struggling to maintain control. But then came the second layer. The cavalry, held in reserve until the infantry had drawn the defenders' attention, now surged forward, their horses thundering across the plains. The horsemen swept around the flanks of the city, their lances gleaming in the pale light, their swords ready to strike. They crashed into the Babylonians like a wave of steel, their momentum carrying them through the ranks of defenders with terrifying force. For a moment, it seemed as though the Persians might break through. The Babylonians wavered under the relentless pressure, their lines buckling as the cavalry pushed them back. But Ira was there, his presence a cold flame that steadied their resolve. He fought alongside them, the Blazefrost celestial sword a blur of motion, cutting down the Persian riders with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. "Stand firm," Ira shouted, his voice a rallying cry. "They cannot break us if we do not break ourselves. Hold the line." The defenders rallied around him, their fear melting away in the face of his unyielding determination. They fought with renewed vigor, pushing back against the cavalry, their weapons biting deep into flesh and bone. The Persians, though fierce and well-trained, found themselves stymied by the sheer tenacity of the Babylonian resistance. And yet, the worst was still to come. The giants awakened. As the battle raged at the gates, the ground beneath the city began to tremble. At first, it was a faint rumble, barely noticeable above the noise of the fighting. But as the tremors grew stronger, a sense of dread began to spread through the ranks of the defenders. They knew what was coming, and they knew that nothing they had faced so far could compare. Ira felt it too, the deep, bone-rattling vibrations that signaled the approach of the giants. He looked out over the battlefield, his heart a cold, steady beat in his chest, and saw them. The 10 giants, their massive forms moving with a terrifying grace, their eyes burning with the light of molten stone. They were coming for Babylon, coming to tear down its walls, to crush its people beneath their feet. "Prepare yourselves," Ira shouted, his voice cutting through the fear that had begun to creep into the hearts of his men. "The giants are coming. Do not let them through." But even as he spoke, he knew that this would be the true test. The walls of Babylon had been built to withstand the might of men, but these were no ordinary foes. The giants were beings of ancient power, born of the earth itself, and they carried with them the strength of the mountains. With a roar that shook the heavens, the giants reached the city gates. Gruggith, the largest and most fearsome of them all, led the charge, his massive fists crashing against the stone with the force of 1,000 hammers. The gates, reinforced with iron and steel, shuddered under the impact, the very ground quaking with the power of the blow. The Babylonians, who had fought so bravely against the Persians, now found themselves staring into the face of true terror. The giants loomed over them, their eyes blazing with a hatred that seemed to burn through the very air. The defenders, who had held firm against wave after wave of human soldiers, now wavered, their courage faltering in the face of such overwhelming power. Gruggith struck again, and this time the gates could not withstand the force. With a deafening crack, the stone and iron gave way, the massive doors splintering and crumbling as the giants pushed through. The walls that had stood as Babylon's first line of defense were breached, and the giants surged forward, their laughter a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the city like the tolling of a funeral bell. Panic spread through the Babylonian ranks like wildfire. The soldiers who had fought so bravely now found themselves scattering in fear, their weapons falling from trembling hands. The giants moved through the streets, their massive feet crushing everything in their path, their hands tearing through stone and wood as if it were nothing. The battle with the giants. Ira watched from atop the walls as the giants breached the gates and began their rampage through the city. His heart clenched with a mixture of anger and fear, anger at the devastation being wrought upon the city he had sworn to protect, and fear at the sheer power of the creatures that now threatened to destroy everything. But he could not allow that fear to control him. He was the protector of Babylon, and it was his duty to face these monsters, no matter the cost. Drawing the Blazefrost celestial sword, Ira steeled himself and leaped from the wall, the cold wind whipping around him as he descended. He landed with the grace of a predator, his sword gleaming with the cold light that had become his trademark. The ground beneath him froze at his touch, the air around him chilling as he approached the giants. Gruggith, sensing the presence of the warrior who had defied the Persians before, turned his massive head and fixed Ira with a gaze that could have melted stone. But Ira was unmoved. He raised the Blazefrost celestial sword, the blade humming with a power that sent shivers through the very air. The cold within him surged, filling him with the strength he needed to face these ancient beings. With a shout that echoed through the ruined streets, Ira charged at the nearest giant, his sword cutting through the air with deadly precision. The blade struck true, slicing into the giant's leg with a force that would have felled any mortal creature. But the giant, born of earth and stone, barely flinched. The wound, though deep, did not bleed. It merely exposed the raw, rocky core of the creature's body. The giant turned, its massive fist swinging down toward Ira with the speed of an avalanche. Ira barely had time to react. He dodged to the side, the giant's fist slamming into the ground where he had stood just moments before, sending a shockwave through the earth that nearly knocked him off his feet. The sheer power of the blow was enough to make Ira's blood run cold, but he did not hesitate. He struck again, this time aiming for the giant's arm, hoping to find a weakness in the creature's stony hide. But once again, the blade cut through stone and earth, and once again, the giant shrugged off the blow as if it were nothing more than a mosquito bite. Ira gritted his teeth, his frustration mounting. These creatures were unlike anything he had ever faced before. Their strength was beyond comprehension, their resilience unmatched by any foe he had encountered. It was then that Ira noticed something, a faint glimmer of frost where his sword had struck. The cold of the Blazefrost celestial sword had left its mark, a patch of ice clinging to the giant's flesh, the only sign that his attacks had any effect at all. A realization struck Ira like a bolt of lightning. These creatures were born of the earth, forged in the fires of the world's creation. They were nearly impervious to physical attacks, but they were not immune to the cold. The ice that clung to the giant's wound was a sign, a hint of vulnerability that Ira could exploit. He raised his sword again, but this time, he focused not on strength, but on the cold. He channeled the power within him, the frost that had become a part of his very being, and let it flow into the blade. The air around him grew colder still, the ground beneath him freezing as the Blazefrost celestial sword pulsed with icy energy. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, Ira struck again, his blade slicing through the air and connecting with the giant's arm. This time, the effect was immediate. The cold surged through the giant's body, spreading from the point of impact like a wave of frost. The giant let out a roar of pain, its movements growing sluggish as the cold took hold, freezing the very essence of the creature. But Ira was not finished. He could feel the power within him growing, a cold fire that burned brighter with each passing moment. And as he prepared to strike once more, the black iron horse appeared beside him, its eyes glowing with the same icy light. The horse reared back, its mouth opening wide, and from its maw, a blast of freezing air erupted, enveloping the giant in a cloud of frost. The combination of the cold from the Blazefrost celestial sword and the black iron horse's breath was too much for the giant to bear. Its body began to crack, the stone splintering under the intense pressure of the cold. Gruggith, who had been watching the battle with a mixture of anger and fear, let out a bellow of rage. "Retreat!" Gruggith roared, his voice echoing through the streets. "Retreat, or we will be destroyed." The other giants, sensing the danger, began to pull back, their massive forms retreating from the city they had sought to destroy. But Ira was not content to let them go so easily. He leaped onto the back of the black iron horse, and together, they charged after the fleeing giants, their combined power a force of nature that the giants could not withstand. The cold air around them thickened, turning the ground to ice, freezing everything in its path. The giants, once so powerful, now found themselves in a desperate retreat, their bodies cracking and splintering under the relentless assault of Ira and his steed. Gruggith, the mightiest of them all, let out one final, agonized roar as the cold finally took hold, his body shattering into 1,000 pieces as he fell. The fall of the Persian army. With the giants defeated, Ira turned his attention to the Persian army. Cyrus the Great, who had watched the battle from a distance, could hardly believe what he had seen. His plan, his secret weapon, had been shattered by a single man, a man who wielded a power that defied all understanding. "Retreat!" Cyrus shouted to his generals, his voice filled with frustration and anger. "We cannot defeat him. Fall back." The order spread through the ranks like wildfire. The Persian soldiers, who had once been so confident in their victory, now found themselves fleeing in disarray. The cold that Ira had unleashed upon the giants now spread through the army, the desert-hardened soldiers unprepared for the sudden, bone-chilling frost that seemed to come from nowhere. Ira and the Black Iron Horse tore through the retreating Persians like a storm of ice and steel, cutting down those who tried to stand and sending the rest fleeing in terror. The cold followed them, freezing their breath, numbing their limbs, and turning the once arid ground beneath their feet into a frozen wasteland. Cyrus, knowing that his army was on the brink of collapse, made the only decision he could. He ordered a full retreat, pulling his remaining forces back from the city that had defied him once again. He had failed, and the name of Babylon would remain a curse on his lips for as long as he lived. As the Persians fled into the distance, leaving behind the shattered remnants of their once mighty force, Ira finally reigned in the Black Iron Horse. The city of Babylon, though battered and bruised, still stood, its walls a testament to the resilience of its people and the power of the man who had saved them. But as Ira stood there, watching the last of the Persians disappear over the horizon, he felt no triumph, no sense of victory. The cold within him, the power that had brought him through this battle, was still there, a reminder of the cost of the strength he wielded. He had saved Babylon, but at what price? The giants were defeated, the Persians driven back, but the cold that had won the day was a cold that had begun to seep into his very soul. And as he sheathed the Blazefrost celestial sword, Ira knew that the battle was far from over. For the second time, Cyrus the Great had failed to conquer Babylon. But the war was not yet won, and the cold fire within Ira still burned, a fire that could not be extinguished, even in the heart of the fiercest storm. The silent ghost of love. The city of Babylon was alive with the sound of celebration. The streets, which had only hours before echoed with the clamor of battle, now thrummed with the pulse of life and joy. The people, their faces alight with relief and triumph, filled the thoroughfares, their voices raised in song and laughter. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine wafted through the air, mingling with the fragrant smoke of incense that burned in honor of the gods. Babylon, once on the brink of destruction, now stood defiant, its people united in their jubilation. The victory over the Persian army had lifted the dark cloud that had hung over the city for so long. The fear that had gripped the hearts of the Babylonians had given way to a euphoric release, and they poured their joy into the night, determined to banish the memory of war with the brightness of their revelry. The streets were lined with torches, their flames flickering like fireflies in the darkness, casting a warm glow over the faces of the revelers. Music filled the air, the rhythm of drums and the sweet notes of flutes intertwining with the voices of the crowd. Children, who had been sheltered away during the battle, now ran through the streets, their laughter clear and bright, a sound that had been absent for too long. Women danced with flowers in their hair, their movements graceful and free, their joy infectious. Men raised their cups and toasts, their voices booming with praise for the warriors who had defended the city. The sound of clinking cups and the hum of conversation filled every corner, as though the city itself was sighing in relief. But amid the celebration, amid the sea of smiling faces and the chorus of voices, one figure remained aloof, untouched by the revelry that surrounded him. Ira, the savior of Babylon, stood at the edge of the festivities, his expression unreadable, his eyes distant. His body was still clad in the armor of battle, the frozen blood of the Persian army staining his skin and clothes, a reminder of the fierce struggle that had only just ended. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of the Blazefrost celestial sword, the cold of the blade seeping into his flesh, a familiar chill that steadied him, that kept the warmth of the celebration at bay. His soldiers, the men who had fought beside him, who had seen him cut down the giants and drive back the Persians, approached him with reverence, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. They offered him their thanks, their congratulations, their awe, but Ira accepted it all with a calm, almost detached demeanor. He nodded at their words, gave them quiet words of encouragement, but his heart was not in the celebration. For while the city rejoiced, while the people of Babylon filled the night with their joy, Ira's thoughts were elsewhere. They were with a woman who had remained untouched by the chaos of battle, a woman whose heart had remained cold and distant, even as the city she called home had been saved from destruction. Belshaltinana. The Unseen Journey. As the celebration continued around him, Ira turned away from the festivities, his steps silent as he moved through the streets. The sounds of laughter and music faded into the background as he made his way toward the temple, the place where Belshazzar had chosen to devote her life, away from the world of men, away from the tumult of emotion and conflict. The temple stood at the edge of the city, a place of quiet contemplation, its walls high and austere, its gates closed to the world outside. It was a sanctuary, a place where the noise of life did not intrude, where the concerns of the flesh were left behind, and where the soul could seek solace in the embrace of the divine. Ira approached the gates with a sense of purpose, his heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of emotions that had been kept locked away for too long. He did not hesitate as he pushed open the gates, the sound of the heavy wood creaking in the stillness of the night. The air inside the temple grounds was cool and clean, free of the smoke and noise that filled the city. The only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft whisper of nature's breath. He walked the stone path that led to the heart of the temple, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The temple loomed before him, its columns tall and imposing, its doorways shadowed and silent. There was no one to greet him, no priest or acolyte to bar his way. He was alone, as he had so often been, with only his thoughts to accompany him. Finally, he reached the inner sanctum, the place where Belshazzar would be. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the stone wall, feeling the coolness seep into his skin. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and then pushed open the door. She was there, just as he knew she would be. Belshazzar stood at the far end of the chamber, her back to him, her form silhouetted against the flickering light of the oil lamps that lined the walls. She was dressed in the simple robes of a priestess, her hair falling in dark waves down her back, her figure slender and graceful. She was a vision of serenity, a statue carved from the very essence of stillness. But Ira knew better. He knew that beneath that calm exterior, there was a heart that beat with life, a soul that had chosen to remain apart from the world, a soul that he longed to reach, to touch. Belshazzar, he said softly, his voice breaking the silence like a ripple across a still pond. She did not turn to face him, did not acknowledge his presence with anything more than the faintest tilt of her head. It was as if she were listening to something far away, something that only she could hear. "I have come to see you," Ira continued, stepping further into the room. "The city is safe. The Persians have been driven back. I needed to see you." Still, she did not turn. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick, like a wall that Ira could not break through. He hesitated, his words caught in his throat, but then he pushed forward, driven by the need to express what had been building inside him for so long. "I fought for Babylon, but in truth, I fought for you. Every time I drew my sword, every time I faced the enemy, it was your face that I saw. Your voice that guided me. I know that you have chosen a different path, that your heart lies here, in this temple. But I cannot help what I feel." He paused, his breath shallow, his chest tight. "I thought that, perhaps, if I could protect the city, if I could bring you peace, you might see me differently. That you might look at me, and see not just a warrior, but a man. A man who loves you." Belshazzar remained silent, her figure as still as stone. The shadows danced around her, playing tricks with the light, making her seem almost unreal, like a ghost that had taken form in the dim glow of the lamps. Ira felt a pang of despair, a coldness that crept into his heart, more chilling than the frost of his sword. He had faced the giants without fear, had stood against the might of the Persian army with unshakable resolve, but here, in this quiet chamber, he felt helpless, powerless. "I know that you do not feel the same," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I know that your heart belongs to the gods, that you have chosen a life of solitude. But I had to tell you, I had to speak these words, even if they fall on deaf ears." The silence stretched again, wrapping around Ira like a shroud. He could feel the weight of his own words, heavy and painful, pressing down on him. He had hoped for a response, a sign, anything that would let him know that he had been heard, that he had not been speaking to an empty room. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement, only the stillness of the chamber and the flickering of the lamps. Ira felt his heart sink, the coldness spreading through him like ice. He had fought for so long, had given everything he had, and yet here, in the presence of the one person he cared for more than anything, he felt utterly alone. He took a step back, his hand brushing against the hilt of the Blazefrost celestial sword. The cold of the blade seeped into his skin, grounding him, reminding him of the path he had chosen, the path he had walked for so long. "Goodbye, Belshaltinana," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sadness that he could not hide. "I will not trouble you again." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence, the coldness clinging to him like a second skin. He left the temple behind, the door closing with a soft thud, the sound barely audible over the noise of the wind that had begun to stir outside. The disquiet of victory. Ira stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at his skin, the wind whipping around him like a living thing. The sounds of celebration had died down, the city now resting in the quiet of the early hours. The torches had burned low, the streets empty save for the occasional stray dog or lone figure making their way home. He walked through the city, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, his heart heavy with the weight of his unspoken love, of his unanswered questions. The joy that had filled the streets earlier now seemed distant, a memory that did not belong to him. The Blazefrost celestial sword, which had felt so powerful in his hands during the battle, now felt like a burden, a reminder of the coldness that had become a part of him. The black iron horse, which had carried him through the thick of the fighting, now stood silently in the shadows, its breath a cloud of frost in the night air. Ira's mind drifted back to the temple, to the figure of Belshaltinana standing in the shadows, silent and unmoved. He had hoped that she might see him differently, that she might recognize the love he bore for her, but she had remained distant, unreachable. He had saved the city, but he could not save his own heart. As he walked, the coldness within him deepened, the frost creeping into his soul, hardening him against the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. The warmth of love, of hope, seemed a distant dream, something that belonged to another world, another life. He had been a hero today, but what did it matter if the one person he wanted to notice did not? The night stretched on, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds, the wind whispering secrets in a language only it could understand. Ira felt the weight of his own existence pressing down on him, the cold and the darkness becoming one, wrapping around him like a cloak. He had fought for Babylon, but it was Belshaltinana who had been at the center of his thoughts, who had driven him to such heights of power and resolve. But now, with the battle won and the city safe, he was left with nothing but the echo of his own unrequited love, a love that had been met with silence and indifference. Ira stopped in the middle of the street, his breath visible in the cold air, his hand resting once more on the hilt of his sword. The city was quiet, the silence stretching out before him like an endless abyss. "Is this what victory feels like?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely more than a breath. "Is this the price of power, of strength? To be left alone in the cold, with nothing but the ghosts of what could have been?" The wind answered with a low moan, the sound carrying through the empty streets, a lament for a hero who had saved a city but could not save himself. Ira lowered his head, his eyes closing against the cold, against the pain that gnawed at him from within. The warmth of life, of love, seemed so far away, so unattainable. He had been forged in the fires of war, but the fire had turned to ice, freezing him from the inside out. The people of Babylon would celebrate their victory, they would rebuild their lives and their city, but Ira would remain as he had always been, a warrior, a man of cold fire, a man who fought for others but had nothing to fight for himself. The night closed in around him, the darkness swallowing the light, the cold seeping into every corner of his being. He was a hero, but he was also a ghost, a shadow that moved through the world without leaving a mark. And as he stood there, alone in the silence, Ira knew that the battle was far from over. The war within him, the struggle between the warmth of life and the coldness of power, would continue, would rage on until there was nothing left but ice and shadow. For now, though, he would return to his duties, he would protect the city and its people, even as the cold continued to creep into his soul. He would be the hero they needed, even if it meant sacrificing the warmth of his own heart. The night was long, and the cold was deep, but Ira would endure, as he always had. For that was his nature, the nature of the Blazefrost celestial sword, the nature of the man who wielded it, a man forged in the fires of war, tempered by the frost of his own soul. And so, Iroh walked on, disappearing into the darkness, his figure a silhouette against the dim light of the distant torches, a silent ghost in the city he had saved.